In the previous video, we discussed what makes consumers determine how much they will buy given prices, and what makes firms produce their profit-maximizing quantities given prices. It is time to meet both sides of the market and discuss what will the ultimate price be in this market and how much the market will end up buying and selling at this price. In other words, it's time to discuss market equilibrium. A very simplistic and a very naive way to look at equilibrium is a point where demand equals supply. For example, in this hypothetical market for books, the price which makes the quantity demanded equal the quantity supplied is equal to 8. If for any reason the price goes above the equilibrium price, consumers will optimally reduce their quantity demanded. This is because at higher prices, your willingness to pay has to be higher to make you buy that good. But to make you willing to pay more for a certain good, you have to have less of that good to begin with. So when a price goes up, only those consumers with the highest willingness to pay remain in the market and the quantity demanded shrinks. At the same time, firms will optimally increase their quantity supplied. This is because when a firm needs to produce more, its marginal costs go up. That is, every additional quantity of the good costs you more to produce. However, as the price increases, it can cover the marginal cost for a higher quantity of production. And as a result, it's optimal for the firm to increase production when the price goes up. We call the above scenario excess supply. A scenario in which for some reason the market price ends up being above equilibrium, and as a result we have more quantity of that good than consumers are willing to buy at that price. The opposite scenario occurs when we have the market price being temporarily below the equilibrium price. This covers the marginal cost for a lower quantity of the good produced, and therefore firms will optimally reduce their quantity supplied in the marketplace. However, with a lower price, consumers would optimally demand more books. This is because the consumers with the lower willingness to pay will suddenly show up on the market, thereby raising the quantity of books that the market can absorb at this price. As the quantity demanded is higher than the quantity supplied, we call this situation excess demand. To sum up, the reductionist definition of equilibrium is a price and a quantity for which there is no excess demand or supply. In other words, a price and a quantity for which there is market clearing. However, there is more to equilibrium than just market clearing. We saw that what underlies demand is the consumer's willingness to pay, which in turn is driven by the consumer's marginal utility. At the same time, what underlies supply is marginal costs, and the fact that when a price increases, firms are deriving higher profits with more production. So, on both sides of the market, there is always a maximization process happening, and equilibrium is the consequence of this maximization process. We have a definition that accommodates all that. Let's see it. Equilibrium in a certain market for a good or a service X occurs when we can find the price P star and a quantity Q star which satisfy three important conditions at the same time. First, at this price, it's optimal for consumers to demand this quantity. In other words, we need consumers to maximize utility given their budget constraint, and as a result of this maximization process, we need them to arrive at the quantity Q star. And second, P star and Q star have another special property. They make firms maximize profits given their own demand constraint. P star and Q star are a result of this maximization process happening at the firm level. And finally, when both maximization processes occur, we not only need consumers and firms to maximize utility and profits, we also need the utility maximizing quantities and the profit maximizing quantities to be the same for both consumers and firms. Only then we can say that market's clear. When we have a price and a quantity satisfying these three conditions at the same time, we can safely say that the market is in equilibrium. But as we saw in the previous video, there are numerous factors which can change the way consumers think and can change the marginal costs for the firm as well. Now, as a result, there are numerous factors which drive the market away from a state of equilibrium. Once that happens, however, market equilibria have the property of being self-perpetuating. That is, once a market is in a state of excess demand or an excess supply, once the market has a shortage or a surplus, it gradually moves back to equilibrium. During the seminars this week, we'll discuss why equilibria are self-perpetuating. But before we move to the seminars, we need to be able to understand a slightly more restrictive class of market equilibria. Equilibria that happen under the assumption that neither the firms nor the consumers can affect the market price in any way. In other words, an equilibrium in which consumers and firms are so tiny relative to the size of the market that they become price takers. Price taking means that whatever you produce and whatever you demand, if you suddenly disappear from the face of the earth, no one will ever notice. We need the price taking assumption to be able to derive what happens in the industry producing good X. To be able to focus on the industry dynamics, we need to stop caring about where the price comes from and start caring about the so what question. What happens to firms after the price has been predetermined for them and they just take it as given? During the live lectures this week, we'll play with these scenarios and we'll see some examples of markets in which sellers are price takers and buyers are not. So it will be very good if you think about those issues in advance. But before we move there, I'd like to discuss in further detail the supply side of the market, the size of the market which takes the production decisions. So in the next video, we'll focus on deriving the individual and the market supply. Thanks for watching.